Well, you've seen all the pictures, and Meg's heard pretty much all the pros, but in a different context. But yes, no, it's nice. It's nice to have it.
So you presented this.
Well, I could give you. She said
just to say, folks, that we are broadcasting, which means that
so no bad language.
Live streaming going on.
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. And we're going to start a little bit later to accommodate the few that are just finishing their food now. But there's time for that because we built in this 15-minute or 10-minute, 15-minute buffer zone, but we don't need it because we've already done it. So if you want to go and admire the beauty of Siam editions and ECM editions or the British Music Collection, that would be a good thing to do. Or to,
Thirsty. Can I water? Extra dead sheep flavour.
Yes, our library has a special committee. That's sensational what Larry does. I haven't read it. It's really fun. I read it. You can still give us that for 2 hours, you know, sure. But no, I just got to
Little things to do with these.
So just need to, no, not make, bollocks.
We can see them. Can they see us?
I don't think so.
Right. Someone's shaking their heads, so they can't see us, but they can hear us. I can deduce that.
They can see the presentation. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so
Right.
just hide from.
They don't need to see me. And the pictures they'll probably have had in their lecture, their conference pack. Is this fully connected to the mains? Because it's only got 63% power on it.
Yes, it's connected now. Yeah, it's just there. Okay, so now there we are. Boom.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, analyse your own. Yes. Who else would go?
This one's got a big.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not some memory reputation.
It's really not. If you want to be really meta, you can actually watch this presentation on your iPhone or on anything that is connected to the internet via yeah, it's a minute late, so try not to.
Well, if you miss anything, you can.
Are we all back?
There isn't a guest password, is there?
That isn't. No, I would have hoped that everybody would have worked. Yeah, let's go. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Wright. I've got the pleasure of chairing this afternoon's session, and a lot of excitement about these Google Hangouts. New term to me. We're going to have two virtual. Now we do have two real, actual speakers. In the form of Magnus Williams. This is the actual Magnus Williamson, as opposed to the virtual one. And we have the actual John Caldwell to look forward to. So, Magnus read music at Magdalen College, Oxford, where he went on to complete a DPhil. For several years, he was lecturer at Somerville College, and in 1997 moved to the University of Newcastle, where he's currently senior lecturer. His research focuses on the music of late medieval and early modern Europe, and especially the sources and contexts of early Tudor polyphony, in which he has published widely. His splendid facsimile and introductory study of the Eton Choir Book, which is sitting next door, and which you must look at if you haven't already seen it, was published by Diam in 2010, and subsequently awarded the Polliska Prize by the AMS. In 2012, he published an edition of Latin polyphony by the Informata Choristarum of his old college, John Shepherd, for ECM, and for the past years has been a vigorous and dynamic general editor of this series. He is currently the principal investigator of a major AHRC research project entitled Tudor Part Books. And today he's going to tell us the story of the Peter Gradual rediscovered. Magnus.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. What follows is just pure description, no analysis whatsoever. So I hope you won't mind. Does everyone have a handout? Thanks. Okay. It seems particularly appropriate in 2015 to discuss a medieval manuscript that has been hidden in plain view for several decades. The 800th anniversary of Magna Carta has provided an opportunity to take stock of several newly discovered copies of one of the founding documents of British constitutionalism. On a slightly less exalted level, perhaps, I should like to share news of a significant musical source, the so-called Peter Gradual, which I found recently among the manuscript holdings of Newcastle University's Robinson Library. First of all, the slightly red-faced circumstances of its rediscovery. As a newly appointed and as yet undisillusioned medievalist in Newcastle's music department, I made an early visit to the University Library's Special Collections section in the autumn of 1997. I asked to see the catalogue of the library's medieval manuscripts. I was given a carbon copy of a typed hand list, a single side of A5 paper with a grand total of 9 entries. The list was unpromising. A Flemish book of hours, a continental breviary, that sort of thing. Not the kind of collection to set musicological pulses racing. A year later, and unbeknownst to me, a large collection of manuscripts and early printed books came into the library's possession with no great fanfare and was quietly accessioned into the special collections. This collection had belonged to the library's benefactor, the book collector Philip Robinson. He died in 1989, and it was on the death of his widow in 1998 that his collection passed to the library, where it remains today. Last autumn, I asked the library's recently appointed special collections librarian to seek out some paleographical samples for me to show to a postgraduate seminar group. I was rather pleased when she produced a fine 14th century Sarum Missal, and positively delighted when there appeared on the table alongside it a large chant book, evidently English, 14th century work with excellent illuminations and some rather interesting end papers. Delight turned to disbelief when I saw sections of mensural notation of the 3rd quarter of the 15th century copied into the structural interstices of the manuscript. Aha! A new source, a new rhythm code for Newcastle University Library. Something to trumpet. Newcastle at last got something half decent to compete with its collection of autographs by Charles Villiers Stanford. It didn't take long to realise, with mingled delight and disappointment, that this wasn't a new source at all, but a long-lost one, the Peter Gradual, which for many years had been known only through a set of negative photostats held at the British Library. So if you go onto the Diam website, you will learn that the parent book, once belonging to the Peter family of Essex and sold by the antiquarian book dealer Bernard Quaritch sometime before the 1950s, was believed to have been sold abroad. Now, it was Margaret Bent who drew our attention to this set of photostats, which reproduced the polyphonic notation that was added to the manuscript in 1460 or thereabouts, judging from the hand. This previously elusive source bears witness to the circulation within pre-Reformation sources of squares or monophonic menstrual melodies used as a basis for improvised or composed polyphony, particularly for movements of the Mass Ordinary and especially for the Kyrie, for which a large number of squares survives. For some years, the editorial series Early English Church Music has planned an edition of this very repertory under the expert oversight of Professor Wright. I shall come back to the squares in a minute, but first, because the Peter Gradual has gone pretty much unnoticed for 60 years, it is worth describing in detail what the contents of the manuscript are. And I've given a short summary of these contents on the handout. There are a couple of typos. Quinquagesima should have another A in it, and Hodierne looks DA is misspelt. My apologies. The main body of the manuscript is a typical late medieval gradual comprising 4 main sections. First of all, the Temporale, the main cycle of Sundays and seasons that starts with Advent Sunday and goes through to the end of the year, just at the end of November. So, for instance, here from the Temporale, I can gauge the quality of the manuscript, extremely fine work, by the opening page of the Mass for Christmas Day with the Introit Poenatus Est. Then, a little bit later on, the propers for the feast of Thomas Becket on the 29th of December, which was abrogated in November 1538, and here we see crossed out, not with great enthusiasm. And then a little bit later on, the Epiphany, where we see this very, very consistent illumination work, clearly demarcating the structural logic of the manuscript. A slight surprise that awaits us further on when we look about halfway through the Temporale, when there's a join between 2 scribally different parts of the manuscript. There are 2 main scribal hands. We've been looking at scribe 2, a later scribe so far, and here you see the join between scribe 2 on the left and scribe 1 on the right. Scribe 1 is a 14th century scribe, let's say notionally about 1370, 1380, and scribe 1, the next generation, probably just after 1400, I think. And I'll explain why there are these 2 scribal sections in a minute. Continuing through very quickly through the temporal, you have Easter, Whitsun, Trinity, and lastly, which would help us to date the manuscript if there was any doubt about the hand, the propers for the Feast of Corpus Christi, a feast which was promulgated in England in the 1320s, initially apparently in Bath and Wells diocese in 1318, then Exeter in 1320, York 1322, and so on. It's interesting to see this feast. Clearly, it postdates the 1320s, but it's not yet as clearly visually signposted as you'd find in later manuscripts and in printed graduals, where Corpus Christi will have more substantial illumination work. Now, it's at the first structural division of the manuscript that we find polyphony for the first time. At the end of the temporal way, typically you have spare unwritten on page, and then on the right-hand side we have the beginning of the sanctoral with the Feast of St. Andrew. And here, for those who collect such things, we have to use the Curtis Wolfe hand list numbers S47 and A28. So a Sanctus and an Agnus Dei. The second main section, the Sanctuary, as we see, begins with the Feast of St Andrew on the 30th of November and proceeds, as you would expect, through the main feasts of the church year. The Annunciation on the 25th of March. We can see here some annotations on the right. I hope everyone can see this, which pertain to the feasts of St David and St Chad, which were instituted at the end of the 14th century. So we see a 13th century manuscript being updated with annotations as we go through the 15th century. Then the Nativity of St Mary on the 8th of September. Later on, we see other added rubrics for the Feast of St Erkenwald, another late medieval addition to the liturgical calendar. And at the end of the Sanctoral, again, at the next major structural division of the manuscript, we have two settings of the Gloria. Like those earlier pieces of polyphony, not actually polyphonic as written, they are monophonic mensural melodies. And these spill over the page. There's a close-up. This has not been professionally digitized yet. This is just my holiday snaps. Busman's holiday. And then you see on the right-hand side the beginning of the Kyriale with Deus Creator Omnium. At the end of the book, there are, after the Kyriale, there are 4 settings of the Kyrie, which we'll meet in a minute. Instead, I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes talking about wear and tear, the customization, lifespan, and afterlife of this medieval manuscript, which is particularly interesting in this case, I think. Peter Graduate is a much-used manuscript. Discoloration of the folios suggests they're having been turned by generations of hands. And at an early point, there must have been some kind of accident, because we saw earlier, the first 41 folios are written in a later hand than the rest of the main part of the manuscript. So perhaps some accident befell the manuscript, and the first few folios were excised and replaced by another set. There's an overlap of contents between the two scribes' work, so it wasn't simply two completely different graduals which are later bolted together like a sort of dodgy insurance job with a written-off car. Sorry, that's probably a rather insular reference there. They probably don't have that in there. But clearly the beginning of the manuscript was irreparably damaged and replaced. And further evidence of the book's use, reuse, and customization can be seen in the book's last few folios, in a collection of Kyrie squares, and in some other end papers which were added in the 16th century. A little bit more evidence of damage being repaired at a relatively early stage. You can see stitching work where the page was ripped. But really, the sort of nodal point of the manuscript is only, in musicological terms, really at the very end, where we find 4 Kyrie squares, each one written in 2 parts. So unlike the other mensural contents, these are actually written out as polyphony, and they're 2 more or less identical voice parts which overlap. And there is much that could be said about these squares, about the interaction of chant and polyphony, about the interrelationship of writing, memory, and improvisation. But these Kyrie squares are a microcosmic case study in perfect and imperfect time, major and minor prolation, and perhaps we might have time to sing one of them later on, although be warned, there are errors in the copying. We don't know where the gradual was originally used, but we can assume that it was confiscated or sold off to a bookbinder for scrap at the Reformation after the use of Sarum was abolished in 1549. And that would usually have been the end of the story, but for the accession of Catholic Mary Tudor, Queen Mary I, in the summer of 1553, at which point, as we well know, once discarded Latin service books were suddenly deployed back in service. So going forward, there is a close of the Kyrie. Maybe look at those there. You can see its resale, its repurchase price of 13 shillings and 4p a mark, or 160 old pence, 66.6 new pence. And this is the price for which the gradual was repurchased in 1553 or 1554. And we know the purchaser because there's an ex dono from the gift of William Peter, Knight, patron of this church. Interesting word, Templi. It doesn't necessarily bespeak Protestantism. You find it, for instance, in the audit books of Eton College under Mary Tudor. So it's quite an interesting. I don't know if anyone's come across this term for 16th century, talking about churches in the 16th century. But this purchaser, Sir William Peter, was patron of none other than Ingatestone Parish Church in Essex. Now, when the use of sarum was once again abolished in 1559, William Peter presumably asked the church wardens to return his gradual to him, thank you very much, and it stayed in the possession of that gentry family until after the First World War or later. Here we see another example of a manuscript which was rescued and held away from the attention of royal busybodies by the Manners family, Earls of Rutland. This book belongs to Lady Elina, previously Paston, of the famous Paston family, but at that time Dowager Countess of Rutland in the 1540s. And it owes its preservation almost certainly to having been owned by a noble family. Now, William Peter's son John is very well known to musicologists as the friend and patron of William Byrd, and as an employer of singers with Chapel Royal connections for whom the Bodleian Music School part book E423 was copied. John Peter provides the final twist in the story of this gradual. Copied into the final verso, 185 verso, is the text of the so-called Praeses in Prostratione, or prayers in prostration, that was said during High Mass under the use of sarum shortly before the Agnus Dei throughout most of the church year. These prayers include three psalms: Deus venerant gentes, Deus miseriatur, and Domine in virtute tua, with the antiphon Tua est potentia. These texts cumulatively emphasize the themes of dispossession, alienation, good kingship, and vindication, themes that were universally appropriate and unobjectionably biblical, but also of great relevance to a family of Catholic recusants whose practicing of the old religion put them at variance with Elizabethan Protestant legislation. We can see traces of this piety in a marginal annotation made on the same folio, hoi me, quia inculatus sum, woe is me, for I am unshriven, which is a paraphrase of Psalm 119, verse 6, hoi mihi domine, quia inculatus meus prolongatus est, woe is me that I am an alien in Meshech, that I must live among the tents of Kedar. Like the rest of the Peter Gradual, the prayers in prostration were copied in an elaborate Gothic script, but this is the work of an enthusiastic but rather unpracticed scribe, most probably an Elizabethan member of the Peter household. And at the very least, we can take note of the fact that William Byrd wrote a setting of the text of Deus venerant gentes, which is copied at the head of the left-hand side, most probably to commemorate the execution of the Catholic missionary Edmund Campion on the 1st of December 1581. The earliest source for Byrd's motet, or at least for its first two sections, is the Peter Contratenor part book that I mentioned a moment ago. So an association with William Byrd would give this manuscript added interest for musicologists. It's not impossible that the composer sang from this very gradual when he is visiting Ingatestone. So by way of conclusions, I'd want to draw three broad areas of conclusion, which are things we already know anyway, but which just this manuscript reminds us of. First of all, it's a highly layered manuscript, like so many of the manuscripts that we look at are, and it's easy to take the polyphony out of that context and to ignore the sort of millefeuille of meanings and layers that are deposed. You know, 14th century core, early 15th century repairs and consolidation, mid 15th century customization, mid 16th century death and near temporary resurrection, and then late 16th century clandestine usage. Secondly, the mingling of polyphony with other formats, which is often overlooked because we all love to look at the big choir books. As Ted Dumitrescu pointed out with regard to the York Masses, they may well have been bound as a fascicle into the front of a missal, which would have been used by a celebrant, maybe as a side altar. When we look at Lansdowne 462, I'll come back to that in a minute. Lansdowne 462, excuse me. We see another famous gradual with mensural melodies of this very type written in. And you hardly need to look far when you're looking at printed sources, little dotting of the far burden melody there in a Sarum hymnal from the second quarter of the 16th century. A 15th century processional with a processional psalm laudate, Bury, again with polyphony, palimpsested onto it. And you keep coming across this time and time again. Printed book I spoke about last December at All Souls, where we find squares for the litany written out at the bottom of the page. John Milsom has talked recently about part leaves as being a sort of major means for the circulation of music, especially at Peterhouse in Cambridge. I think these scruffy formats have got so much to tell us, but we all know that anyway. And lastly, performance practice questions. The mixture of monophony and two-part polyphony in one book seems puzzling. Were there any companion books which also contained parts which might have gone with this, or where were these books placed, on a lectern in medio chori, or on reading desks laterally in the choir stalls? How many people participated in the singing of this polyphony? You would assume this would be a lectern book with one or two people singing from it, but at Magdalen College, Oxford in 1531-1532, we find payments to two of their lay clerks, Bull and Norwich, pro pricking of squares in 12 gradalibus in Capella, and then another payment the same year for pricking of squares in 3 more graduals. Evidence from pre-Reformation book inventories, Winchester College, Leicester's Augustinian Abbey, for instance, suggests that singers shared a gradual, 2 or more singers to each book, so the Magdalen squares could easily have served 30 voices. Were these multiple copies meant to ensure consistency of contents across the college's entire collection of liturgical books, all copied at the same time with the same text, regardless of who is using them in any one service? Or are we looking at polyphony that was being improvised by 30 people simultaneously? And at this point, I look to my colleagues in the front row for answers to that question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is just wonderful. And it shows that lost manuscripts can be every bit as exciting as newly discovered ones, if one can actually make that distinction. I'm sure there are questions.
I have thank you for fascinating paper. I have a question about how did the manuscript end up in the collection of this person who donated it? Does he have any sort of record acquisition?
Philip Robinson left about 750 books to my university library, a very small number of manuscripts, mainly printed books from a very wide number of places. He is quite a voracious collector. So I suspect he went down to Quaritch's and just had a browse around. And he was a book dealer who clearly didn't like to let go of some of his books, as is fairly common with book dealers. It's like antique dealers, isn't it, now, to keep that.
But if he was a book dealer, he didn't have a record of acquisition. He had no track of...
There isn't one surviving as far as I know.
So I would have thought he would have documented.
Well, he bought it at Bernard Quaritch's, so there may well be the Quaritch sale catalogue, which I haven't looked at yet.
Well, this is absolutely wonderful, because when I found these negative photostats in the 1960s and pressed as hard as I could as to who had bought them at the Sotheby's sale, and the British Library had got these photostats of the polyphonic, about 40 of them. They said, we can't disclose who bought it. And so it must have been Quaritch and Philip Robinson. But nobody would. No, I wasn't able to take it any further, so I just dropped at that point until you revived it. Lovely to see them black on white instead of white on black.
So the photostats were only of the polyphony?
They were, yes, only of the polyphonic bits.
This has never been cleared. This has never been clear to a lot of people who use it. It's just
No, it's just
the extent
yes. I just
of the
went
material.
through all the photostats that the British Library had retained of things that had come up for sale, and this was the most interesting part of that collection. So I sort of made it known a bit then, but wasn't able to follow up and find the rest. I didn't know whether it was all of the mensural sections on it. That's great.
Andrew, Magnus, I don't know if I missed this, but are we to assume that these single parts, the copied then, are copied these squares? That's the idea. With Gloria, 2 and 9 was settings on 172 relative versa, 110 versa. Those were. Are they? Which parts are they then? This is concerned.
Don't know. It doesn't got. It hasn't got a label on the earlier bits. As far as I recall. They've got labels on the 2-part polyphony. Excuse me, I'm going crazy here. They're labels where you've got it in 2 parts because you've got medius and tenor.
Yeah.
But I think it's just C4 clefs for the other stuff. There we go. I'll go forward 1 because there's a cloak. No, there isn't. So that's all you have.
There are 2 other cases of 2-part mensural in the Christchurch Oaks 253, I think it is, that I looked at that many years ago. There are 2 parts, not just the square part. So the question does arise: what sort of use was made of those? Were they the 2 lower parts to which 3rd top part?
Yes, because it seems bizarre to have 2-part polyphony provided for the Kyries because they're much easier to improvise because it's short, it's very formulaic. You know, the melodies are very easy. You can easily remember them. Whereas I cannot hold in my mind's ear how that Gloria and then that Santa Sinanius go there. Much more difficult proposition as an improviser.
Yeah.
Have you had an art historian look at the art? Do we know anything about them? They look very peculiar to me. So, the initials.
No, I haven't yet. I've been hoarding it so far. And I think when we get it digitized, which I'm hoping to do under the auspices of the Tudor Park Books project, hence all the logorrhea at the beginning of the... Yes, quite. In its book. And I think at that point, it'd be good to get some brains around the table. The plan at the moment is to have the PMMS in Newcastle in April 2016 and have this as one of the sort of items on display. And that would be a great moment to get some sort of Nigel Morgan or type people involved in it.
Any questions? In which case, I think we just thank Magnus.
One tiny question. Magnus, the ones that are marginal annotations, are they of text only? Or are they
text only, no tunes. Yeah. There's one short segment of tune in one. It's it's an Alleluia, but it's literally for about 5 minutes. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, there's this lot, and there's also I think they're not.
No, nothing like that. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Right. Will you be using...
No, I'm not.
All right. Okay, cool. There's people that want to be watching this, so... Okay. Turn the projector.
Will that you reduce? Will that you reduce them?
Yeah, and what? And the YouTube stream. Yeah, pretty much.
So two handouts going around. One is a.
Yeah, there's a few people watching from there.
Yes,
I can if I stand up, but they can't see my face. No, it's all right. No, I get to sit back. Very well.
Yes, yes. John Caldwell is an emeritus fellow at the University of Oxford, where he taught for nearly 40 years and enlightened generations of students in the pleasures and puzzles, but almost said pains there, the pleasures and puzzles of medieval music. He is perhaps best known to readers for his authoritative 2-volume Oxford History of English Music and his indispensable guide to editing early music. But his scholarly publications encompass much else besides, including several major editions, most recently of the Mulliner book for Musica Britannica. He is, moreover, one of that rare breed of academics who managed to combine a successful career as a professional musicologist with a productive output as a composer. The Festschrift published in his honour in 2010 includes a selective list of no fewer than 79 compositions. John was a founding editor of Plain Song and Medieval Music and served as general editor at EECM from 1995 to 2008, during which time he oversaw the transformation of the series' editorial policy. And this afternoon he is talking, or showing us how to understand the medieval psalter.
Thank you very much. Much of that is unjustified, but never mind about that. And I must apologise to those who know all about the medieval psalter already, and apologise also to those for whom it is not a major interest. But I think it's worthwhile having a glance at what is involved. The Psalter is the only book of the Hebrew Bible to have retained its separate identity from the pre-Christian era into modern Christian times. While all the books of the Hebrew Bible were originally separate volumina, that is to say scrolls, no other, with rare exceptions, continue to be copied in Greek and Latin translations as an individual book for devotional or liturgical use. Even when copied as part of a larger entity, such as a Bible, a breviary, or an antiphonal, the Psalter often retains a distinct appearance by virtue of its script, or in printed editions, its typography. In a liturgical compilation, it will often be a discrete book within a book, occupying a whole number of gatherings with their own set of identifying signatures. The usual medieval Latin version of the Psalter was a translation from the Greek, itself a version of the Hebrew Psalter. There were several Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, but the only one that need concern us here is the so-called Septuagint, made for Greek-speaking Jews of the pre-Christian diaspora. This text was turned into Latin early in the Christian era for use in the Latin-speaking West. Several forms of this Old Latin Psalter exist, the most notable being the Roman Psalter, which has sometimes been considered to be an early revision of the text by St. Jerome. Whether that is the case or not, St. Jerome was certainly responsible for a more extensive revision, for which he used a text established by Origen in a mammoth project known as the Hexapla, in which 4 Greek translations of the whole Bible were placed in parallel columns against the Hebrew text, which was written in both Hebrew and Greek characters. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this work has survived only in fragments. In editing the Septuagint text, however, Origen attempted to reconcile it with the Hebrew, adding passages missing from the Greek, indicated by an asterisk, and marking additions in the Greek, which are not in the Hebrew, with an obelus. By obelus, he means something that looks a little bit like a division sign, a line with a dot below and above. He did not intend this version for liturgical use. Origen did not, that is to say, but became, in Jerome's Latin translation, the standard liturgical text. It's not in my paper, but I'm always amused by one particular little bit which is in the Septuagint and the Latin version of it, but which is not in the Hebrew. Not so are the wicked, not so. That extra not so, non-sic, is an addition which is stuck in the liturgical text sung in the Latin Church. St. Jerome also made a translation of the Psalter, together with the rest of the Bible, directly from the Hebrew, and some of the oldest Latin manuscripts, including the earliest surviving complete Latin Bible, the Codex Amiatinus, incorporate this version. However, it seems never to have been used liturgically. In the early Middle Ages, the contest was between the Roman Psalter and Jerome's version of Origen's hexaplar text. This latter became the standard version in the Frankish kingdom, and when Alcuin made a recension of the whole Latin Bible, he incorporated this version, rather than the translation from the Hebrew, in what became known as the Editio Vulgata, the standard version, as it were. According to St. Hilary of Poitiers, it was the Greeks who first numbered the Psalms, and indeed the numbering 1 to 150, together with the spurious Psalm 151, does appear in the earliest Greek Bibles. This is the numbering that has always been used in the Latin West, and St. Hilary's contention is borne out by the fact that the earlier manuscripts of Jerome's translation from the Hebrew incorporate that numbering. It differs slightly from what has become known as the Hebrew numbering, adopted in Protestant Bibles on the basis of medieval Hebrew texts. So we stick to the Greek Latin numbering as being of at least equal authenticity. As for the verses, these were never numbered in medieval manuscripts of the Psalter, although they were sometimes counted. Early Greek and Latin manuscripts in large uncials, however, arranged the texts as a series of short hanging paragraphs, and these usually correspond to 1/2 or 1/3 of a liturgical verse. There was no punctuation. This arose only when the texts came to be written out continuously, as if in prose. In Hebrew Bibles, however, the medieval punctuation presupposed a rather different distribution of the text into verses, and the numbering that results from this was incorporated first into the Vatican edition of the Greek Bible, and then into the Latin Bibles of Popes Sixtus V and Clement VIII, upon which they became a standard method of reference. It is unfortunate that this verse numbering does not reflect the liturgical practice of the Latin Church, and it has sometimes been replaced, for example in the Liber Usualis, by one that does. To begin with, the Psalter was not specially adapted for liturgical use. In the best known of the various arrangements, the Benedictine and the Roman, the majority of Psalms 1 to 108 were sung at Matins during the course of a week, and 109 to 147 at Vespers. The exceptions were distributed among the other offices. Of course, the most convenient way of sorting this out in your minds is to consult John Harper's Forms and Orders of Western Liturgy, which has an excellent appendix showing the arrangement of the Psalms in the liturgical offices. However, canticles and hymns came to be added to the Psalters early on, and the canticles, with some other materials, were normally added to the non-liturgical or devotional Psalter in the later Middle Ages. The fourth psalmodic item at Lauds, in both traditions, the Benedictine and the Roman, was always an Old Testament canticle, while the Gospel canticles, Benedictus and Magnificat, were included in Lauds and Vespers respectively. The Nunc Dimittis became part of Compline in the Roman, but not the Benedictine rite. The third nocturne of Matins in the Benedictine rite, however, consisted of 3 Old Testament canticles sung under a single antiphon. The 14th century Macclesfield Psalter, which I mentioned because it's been reproduced in facsimile, today owned by the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, is a typical devotional psalter of the later Middle Ages. It contains a calendar of Sarum Use, an introductory prayer, the 150 psalms, the canticles for Lauds from Monday to Saturday, the Te Deum, Benedicite for Lauds on Sunday, Benedictus, Magnificat, Nunc Dimittis, Quicumque Vult for Prime, that's the so-called Athanasian Creed, the Litany of Saints, the Office of the Dead, and finally some miscellaneous prayers. The user, who may have been a cleric, could dip into this as required, but like many other psalters, it is too elaborate and precious to have been used in choir on a regular basis. Many such psalters, indeed, have been mutilated by collectors of historiated initials. This particular one is fortunate to have survived almost intact, with only one such initial removed. The remnant of an elaborate psalter in St. John's College, Cambridge, contains the canticles required for monastic matins and some hymns. As the gatherings were numbered, we can see that this is but the tail end of a much larger book, and we can conjecture that it was preceded by a psalter arranged on much the same lines as the Macclesfield Psalter just described. In this case, the complete psalter, which is believed to be from Canterbury, may have been prepared for a high-ranking monk, either a prior of Christ Church or an abbot of St. Augustine's. By this time, however, I'm talking about the later 14th century, the Psalter was coming to be organized more specifically with liturgical use in mind. One of the innovations was to include the ordinary Sunday and weekday antiphons for the whole year, ferial antiphons as they are often called. In general, the Psalter within an antiphonal or noted breviary would notate the music of these antiphons, while the Psalter in a non-notated breviary would not. There were 3 groups of ferial antiphons for Sunday matins, those for the season of Advent, those for the period from the Sunday after the octave of Epiphany to Passion Sunday, and those from the Sunday after the octave of Pentecost until Advent. Of course, the ferial antiphons were frequently superseded by antiphons for feasts occurring during the course of the year. It is doubtful if a whole week ever went by with all the ferial psalms and antiphons being sung. In a musical source, the incipits of the antiphons, one for each of these seasons, would be given before the psalm, together with a differentia or termination of the tone, and the complete antiphons at the end of the psalm or group of psalms, as the case might be. In a breviary without notation, on the other hand, the antiphon text would be given only at the end of a psalm or group of psalms. There seems to have been a convention that in spoken recitation the antiphon was not said first. I base this partly on a post-Tridentine breviary of Cluniac use, a printed one, in which that point is specifically made, but I haven't found any statement to that effect in a pre-Reformation English source. Examples 1 and 2 of your handout, which I've got myself somewhere here. Oh yes, there we are. Examples 1 and 2 illustrate the arrangement of the antiphons for the ordinary Sundays of the year of Matins. Example 1 from Bodley 984, which is the Psalter of a manuscript antiphonal, circa 1400, and secondly from the printed antiphonal of 1519 to 1520. These two extracts show the complete antiphons for the second group of psalms at Sunday Matins, Psalms 7 to 10, and the incipits with their differentiae of the antiphons for Psalms 11 to 14. In example 1 at the top, you can probably see my little penciled annotations. You have Psalm 10 at the top, and then that's followed by the antiphon Erit ipse expectatio, which comes at the end of that group of psalms, 7 to 10. By the way, that little left-hand marginal annotation in my hand, Psalm 7, ignore that. That actually belongs to the previous page of this facsimile. This is from Frere's Antiphonale Salisburiense, and these pages were included in order to provide the music of the antiphons which were not given in the Erlingham breviary, which he used for the beginning of the liturgical year. So we have that antiphon, and then we have the incipit of the next one. What is it? I have to look at the other. Have to look at the other one to get Pulcriores. Thank you, Pulcriores, and the psalm incipit Salvum me fac, which is given with the intonation of the psalm, ta-da-da, and then the termination, ta-da-da-da-da-da-da. And Salvum me fac, of course, is Psalm 11, and that's the first group of the next group of 4 psalms which were sung during the course of the first nocturne of Sunday Matins. And on example 1, you can actually see the whole of Psalms 11, 12, 13, and the whole of 14, so that you can see that there's a great deal more visible in the manuscript Psalter than there is on the double open page of the printed Psalter, which shows the same antiphons for the 3 seasons of the year and the same incipits for the next. Group of psalms, the only initium, so da 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 for Salvum me fac after Pulcriores, and then, of course, for the other 2 antiphons, the tone is different in each case. So on that page, the printed page, you get Psalm 11, and you get the beginning of Psalm 12, Squeco Domine. A liturgical psalter, whether notated or not, represents a compromise between the presentation of the psalms in numerical order and the requirements of offices other than matins and vespers. Canticles and hymns are interspersed as required. Vespers and Compline follow after the weekly round of matins, lauds, and the little hours has been covered. A thorough study of the medieval psalter and its concomitants, the tones to which the psalms were sung, would reveal considerable differences between medieval practice, as exemplified for present purposes by Sarum use, and normal modern practice as represented by the publications of Solesmes. I'll briefly mention some of these. In the first place, there are a few differences in the actual texts of the psalms and canticles. The Solesmes texts, prior to 1970 at least, are those of the Clementine Vulgate, whereas the medieval ones belong to a series of recensions, of which that of Paris in the 13th century was the most influential. The English medieval sources seem to be fairly consistent in their readings, with no obvious differences between secular and monastic sources, but I must admit to having looked at only a small sample. Again, there are differences, again slight ones, in the division into verses and in the divisions within verses. A good example of the latter is in the division of the first verse of Psalm 114. In the Solemn version, this reads, Dilexi quoniam exaudiet Dominus, vocem orationis meae. I have love because the Lord will hear the voice of my prayer. So the colon actually comes at a rather inconvenient place grammatically, although it does divide the verse into two equal halves. But in the Sarum Psalter, it is Dilexi, and then quoniam exaudiet Dominus, vocem orationis mei. This first word, Dilexi, is too short to accommodate the initium and the first half of a psalm tone, so the tonale, as published by W.H. Freer, gives special instructions for this, as it does for another short first verse, Deus, Deus meus, Psalm 62. There are more considerable differences in the form of the psalm tones. The flexa, represented by a fall of a tone or a minor third during the long first half of a verse, is unknown in Sarum or English monastic uses so far as I know. These usages, from the evidence available, also differ from each other. A list of tones added to the Worcester antiphonal differs in many respects from those given in the Sarum tonale. Finally, there are differences in the way in which the tones were accommodated to the texts of the Psalms. This is rather complex, and I'll try and abbreviate this slightly. But the analysis of the text and its application to the tones is based on the principle of accent. The initium is sung in the order in which the syllables come. There is no particular attention to accent there. But in the middle of the psalm tone, the mediatio, there may be either one accent or two accents. And if there are two, the first of them, in medieval usage, must be on an accented syllable, which I interpret to mean to include possibly monosyllables and also the secondary accent of a word, but never the last syllable of a word. If you look at your third example, you see something rather curious. This is also from Bodley 984. And you see the instructions for the first Sunday of Advent. First of all, the Deus in Adiutorium intonation, and the rest of that. And then a series of antiphons, antiphon incipits for the first Sunday of Advent, Benedictus, and then the psalm is ipsum, so you, instead of repeating the word Benedictus in the psalm, you just carry on with the tone Dominus Deus meus. But the next one doesn't belong to the first Sunday of Advent at all, and I was very puzzled for a time as to why it should be included there. The antiphon is Afferte Domino, and the psalm is indeed ipsum. It's Psalm 28, I think I've got the number right. Afferte Domino filii Dei, Afferte Domino filios arietum. Bring to the Lord, sons of God, bring to the Lord the sons of rams. To be absolutely literal about it. So why is this? This antiphon occurs on Epiphany Sunday. What's it doing in the middle of the Advent 1 stuff? Well, the answer is it's to illustrate what might seem to be a rather obvious point, that sometimes the antiphon incipit contains more than one word, so you carry on with the third word of the psalm rather than just the second word of the psalm. You might think that's too obvious a point to be developed and to interrupt the material for the first Sunday of Advent. But it tells us some quite interesting things. It goes back to the Sarum customary, or no, the Sarum ordinal, I should think, in which this point is made, that sometimes the incipit has the first two words of a psalm, and sometimes it only has one word. So Benedictus illustrates one word, followed by the rest of the first psalm verse, and Afferte Domino illustrates two words, followed by the rest of that psalm verse. Now, if you look at that Aferte Domino, the first thing to notice is that it's actually a note missing in the beginning of the antiphon, but that's just a mistake, or perhaps it's become erased somehow. Aferte Domino. And then you're meant to go on. Sorry, I have to do it a bit lower. My voice is very gravelly this afternoon. Aferte Domino, Filii Dei. And then the second half of the verse, which it's very interesting that this should be given, because it shows the point I've been making about accent. Aferte Domino Filius. Aferte Domino Filius Arietum. Sorry, I'll do that again. Aferte Domino Filius Arietum. If it were the solemn pointing, would have put an accent on the last syllable of Filios. Aferte Domino Filios Arietum. And there's not a great deal of evidence. This assertion was made by Peter Wagner 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, in his Einführung, that the medieval way of accenting the psalmody was different from the solemn method. He didn't actually give much in the way of evidence, so it's quite nice actually to see here part of a psalm verse which does actually illustrate that very point. One of the frustrating aspects for anyone seeking to reconstruct a Sarum office is the lack of published information for the performance of the Venite Exultemus Domino. This introduction to the daily office was sung not in the Vulgate text, but according to the Roman Psalter, and was divided into 5 lengthy verses, plus Gloria Patri. That makes 6 in all, and not the usual 12 plus 2 of the Vulgate, which incidentally was included in medieval psalters in its numerical position. The Sarum Tonale gives only its opening verses in the different relevant tones, and few of the surviving notated books seem to have included the Venitare, let alone a complete one. The printed Sarum Antiphonal, for all its bulk, does not even include the text, let alone the music of the Venite. It does, however, have a curious rubric, Nullum versum exaltando, immediately after the directions for the performance of the antiphon on the first Sunday of Advent. If this means that the psalm is to be monotoned, that might explain the lack of music in later medieval sources. Yet the word Venite itself is given an intonation, as it is on each occasion on which it occurs in the Psalter. The rubric is encountered in the Sarum New Ordinal, but not in the 15th century Erlingham Breviary used for the initial section of the facsimile Antiphonale Salisburiense. The latter, moreover, gives a longer intonation for the opening verse and then the complete text. 2 other similar rubrics deserve consideration. One concerns the performance of the psalms at Compline. According to the New Ordinal and the printed antiphonal, they are to be sung sub una voce, nullum psalmum exaltando. This seems more explicit. Have modern editions of Compline been mistaken in prescribing tone 8 throughout all 4 psalms? Again, the Erlingham Breviary is silent on this matter. Finally, there is a more generally applicable rubric at the beginning of the psalms for Sunday matins. Any group of psalms with a single Gloria Patri is to be sung sub una voce, nullum psalmum exaltando, as far as the Gloria itself. This applies to the first nocturne of Sunday matins and to the single nocturnes of matins on weekdays, and it certainly seems a reasonable concession in view of the length of the psalmody. But the singing of the Gloria to the appropriate tone is still necessitated its indication in a notated liturgical psalter. And the fact that the Erlingham Breviary omits the rubric suggests that it was not always observed, even as late as the second half of the 15th century. I've given some thought to how the issues of performance might be overcome, partly by devising a system of pointing that would serve for any tone. Your separate handout gives an example of 2 psalms pointed in such a way as to correspond to the presentation of a tone. In this case, tone 3, which I've given with each of its possible endings, together with the Magnificat, also with its possible endings, as an example of a canticle. My idea is that the whole Psalter could be made available in this way on the internet, together with all possible combinations of tones and their endings. But I also feel that there is a case for a scholarly edition of the Psalter of the Sarum Antiphonal in full. The difficult decision to be made is, of course, the choice of exemplar, whether this be a manuscript antiphonal, such as the one in Bodley 948, or the printed one of 1519 to 20, which at least is a lot easier to read. But the format of a scholarly edition would enable a selection of variant readings to be included, so that any consistent differences between uses, including monastic uses, could be made evident. At the moment, there is very little hard evidence to go on, partly because editors of liturgical books, such as Tolhurst, omitted the Psalms on the grounds that the texts were available elsewhere. Volume 2, which is the Psalter of Proctor and Wordsworth's Breviarium ad usum serum, is not entirely reliable, and in any case it has no music. Although some of this may seem very recondite and far removed from the fascinations of the polyphonic repertory of the 15th century, I believe that an understanding of the Psalter and a familiarity with its musical performance in the office is a fundamental requirement for all of us who want to understand the medieval liturgy in all its depth and complexity. What is becoming clearer to me day by day is the extraordinary sophistication of the late medieval approach to the chanting of the Psalms. The correct declamation of the text was always uppermost in the minds of the singers, and it can be seen to maximum effect in the fully written out version of Psalm 113 in Exitu Israel to Serum tone 8 ending 5, which is the so-called tonus peregrinus in the 1519 to 20 Psalter. Time does not permit further illustration of the details that emerge, but I hope in due course to be able to expatiate on them more fully, if you can bear the thought of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for a characteristically erudite paper, and the one that took us on to a more practical level at the end, and I'm sure the idea of an online Psalter is one that would interest a lot of people. Are there questions?
Could I just ask, this may sound as if it's rather simplifying what you said. I think it's all you're about. Would it be right to say, therefore, if you've got this concept of accentuation, what we might naively think of as simply a random variation, might in fact a deliberate accentuation of corresponding to whatever they thought the important details of definition were.
Oh, you think it might have been different at different institutions?
Well, I don't know.
I think that's perfectly possible. Because when I started on this, I thought I could devise some general principles which would be applicable in all circumstances. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. For example, you have 2 kinds of, if you forgive the technical term, proparoxytone endings. In you can either have something like, yes, that's right. You can either have a word like dominus, or you can have a 2-syllable word followed by a monosyllable like potens est. Well, it turns out that in some contexts, the intervening note, which is a supernumerary note, for dominus, it would anticipate the next note, dominus, but for potens est, it would be potens est. And so how you indicate that kind of subtlety in something that is meant to be applicable to all circumstances, I mean, like my system of pointing, it's very difficult to know how you can actually allow for a subtlety of that kind.
No point made. I suppose, no pun intended, but I suppose my point is in a way more general one, that what we might think of as a random melodic variant may not be any such thing. A repointing of the text or whatever.
Yes.
According to that particular system of transformation, wherever that might, whatever tradition might be. And it's a very simple point I think.
Yes, well, I agree with it in general. I may not have perhaps made sufficiently clear, because one must make it clear whether you're talking about what constitutes the accent in the formula for the tone, and these are particular notes, either one before the end of either half, or one that occurs before that, and which is always a higher note than the tone. So there's that. So there's the identification of the accent in the music, and there's also the identification of the accent in the text. Now, in the words, I think the accentuation is pretty much as the classical scholar would agree with. I don't think, I used to think, but I don't think actually that there are significant medieval variations in the accentuation of words. There is, bound in with the breviary, a document called the Accentuarium, which is a most peculiar document because it doesn't give you any general principles. It just says under which, it gives whole long lists of syllables which in certain contexts are either short or long. And you have to work out the accentuation from that.
So it's a random list, basically.
Yes, yes. Well, I think it's not not quite random, but
Okay.
it's a long list of possible situations which you might encounter in your psalter or in your other liturgical text. But as far as I can see, there are no exceptions there to what the normal classical procedure would be, which is based on quantity. The accent has a definite relation to the quantities of the syllables.
Thank you, John. There has been such a rooting part of the air and breathe. Interesting that the text of the writings,
Yes, that's right.
which suggests to me that this volume ought to be expertly edited. Because either the notes or the example which did the text. Now, it really does call to mind systems of Venetaria as separate books
Yes.
in the Reformation era books, writings from the 16th century, still held the same.
Yes. But the text is printed at the beginning of the printed breviary, the non-notated breviary. Printed breviaries never have music, I think, do they?
No.
No. So it would be accessible to there with anyone with a breviary, but they couldn't get it from the antiphonal. It's rather a surprising omission, and particularly in view of the fact that Psalm 113 is written out in full. And I've got a copy here. I didn't reproduce it for everyone, but if anyone wants to see it, they can see it here. And that's a very complex psalm tone, so it's just as well. It's very nice to have it written out in full. The tonale only gives a selection of verses. And there are some, it just enables you to realize that there is a principle of pointing which is being followed, but it's not one that you would easily work out for yourself without actually having the whole thing written out in full. And the same, I think, is true of the Venite. There's, of course, a Venitare at the end of the Worcester antiphonal and the monastic antiphonal, and that's what I think those who wish to reconstruct offices would have to use. But there's an antiphonal in, or is it a notated breviary? I forget. In Private Hands, mentioned by Freer, or it was in Private Hands. Is it the Dechwer? Does that ring a bell? Dechwer? It could have been, but it belongs to a lord, someone or other. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just more of a comment. I've had communication from those watching from home that if people asking questions could speak up, they're a bit hard to hear.
Oh, right, yes. Can they hear the answers?
Exactly.
Yes.
John, thank you. That was a wonderfully clear and carefully thought out exposition. I hope we have a chance to read it soon. Hearing your comments on these subtleties of accentuation and so on draws to my mind. I assembled at one point all the different ways that, for example, benedicimus te is accented in its polyphonic settings.
Oh, right.
Every possible thing. Benedicimus te, benedicimus te,
yes.
benedicimus te, and so every possible thing. So this indicates a different sensibility about accentuation. To what they
yes.
do in the psalm.
I think it really is completely different.
Yes.
Well, it arises from mensuration apart from anything else, I think, doesn't it?
But you can do anything you like with mensuration. But if you wanted to,
well, that's what they're doing. Yes, they are doing it. That's precisely it, that they are doing anything they like.
I just wanted to flag. I just wanted to flag.
Yes, you're quite right. No,
It does raise an interesting question.
it isn't. Yes, yes.
Well, exactly. How they could say, right, now we can do anything we like.
Yes. Well, I think chanting the Psalms is essentially declaiming the text,
yes.
Whereas I think polyphony, at least of that kind, is thinking of the piece musically first and foremost.
Well, actually, the settings that I'm thinking of are the fairly homophonic settings.
Yes, yes.
Where you can do anything you like.
Yes,
not,
yes.
The servant or the slave of any preconceived
No, that's true.
ideas.
No.
So it's an interesting contrast.
Well, of course, the Macho Creed and Gloria are the Macho, Gloria, and Credo are the archetypal examples, I suppose, of that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you for pointing that out, because I mean, it's something really that needs to be. I don't think it should affect what I think about the chanting of the Psalms, but I do think it's something that needs to be mentioned and, as it were, discounted, if it's possible to discount it as something that should be taken into account in reconstructing
the
chant.
People were doing at the
same
time.
Well, they might not have been the same people.
But surely all singers knew the Psalter. And
yes, I suppose so. But I suppose in the service they might have been different.
Their training would have been in the Psalter. And
yes.
the sense of the great difference of this is something very strange.
Yes, I agree.
Good. Let's move on.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm afraid I may have taken up too long time.
We've got to take 5 minutes while this is set up.
Anyone wants to just refresh their
Did I go on?
No, just
Who's next? It's Monica.
yeah.
What's it? No, like it. Certainly better. Broadcast. Does he want to be presented to everyone? Present to everyone. So you could do that by just clicking. And then also, we want to hide us, don't we?
Hello? Am I audible? Oh, okay, very good. I can't actually hear myself, but all right. I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm...
Okay, yeah, it's coming through.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I can, and I can hear you as well, which is excellent.
Miraculous.
All right, so
are you all set?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen and speak. If you've maybe...
Sorry, yes. Carry on.
I was going to say, perhaps you haven't actually done the introduction, though. I couldn't hear.
No. It's
right.
about to happen, but just one small technical matter. I wonder if would it be better to have the light off?
Yes.
Like the start. Right, welcome, Monica.
Thank you.
Monica Roundy is a graduate student at Cornell University with research interests in iconography, music theory, and the relationships between language and music in the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as in the Middle Ages. The working title of her dissertation is Language, Identity, and the Writing of Music in Sources from 13th Century England. And her paper today is entitled Covers and Versions Translating Medieval Song in Arundel 248. Monica, over to you.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. Is it going through yet?
We're waiting for you now.
Okay.
Oh.
Is it?
Sharing the screen. Yeah,
Is it?
yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That's... Well, that's all right. Okay. Music written in medieval English manuscripts leaves much to the imagination. Today, I would like to focus on one possible approach, or one type of possible approaches, to imagining the ways in which a collection of music may have functioned for those who experienced it, whether as compilers, scribes, singers, or listeners. In the process, I pay particular heed to language, specifically the language of texts that are transmitted with musical notation and in various ways in translation. Scholarly examinations of relationships between words and music in this period are abundant, of course, but few of these contributions engage directly with the trilingual milieu in which many or most of the likely consumers of music manuscripts in England would have lived. In other words, one of the text-to-music relationships that bears further examination is that of the intersection of the multifarious spoken and written worlds of the largely upper-class clerics and other similarly privileged persons who could have commissioned, read, or otherwise had access to the surviving manuscripts that contain music. An approach focusing on translation may help us to further consider possible relationships between what we can reconstruct of musical culture, on the one hand, and the broader cultural and political implications of language choice and usage that increasingly inform cultural and political history of England in the same time period. Translation operates at a nexus of cultural understanding and contestation, and its inherently colonializing tendencies have made it a particularly salient aspect of the history of England following the conquest. The act of translation may intersect with a wide range of contexts and registers, and it also serves as a metaphor for that very kind of intersection. In this way, its function is analogous to that of music, with which it partners in the manuscript under consideration today, to create a rich image of how music and language together might have worked to create a particular kind of experience. In what follows, I consider translation in its most literal sense, a process of semantic or perhaps also syntactic transfer from a source to a target language, always partial, contingent, and fraught. I also consider translation as a way of thinking about analogous musical changes. Translations create multiple versions of an object, or perhaps express the object's multiplicity. The state of getting at or turning towards something that is bound up in the very word version is an apt characterization of that process, and one that may usefully be transferred into the sphere of music. Drawing on recent and seminal work by Artis Butterfield and Helen Deeming, as well as earlier work by John Stevens and Frank Harrison and others, I attempt to identify some of the roles of music and translation that are implied in the manuscript British Library Arundel 248. Contrafacta are familiar phenomena to us all, of course, but what in this particular instance did it mean to write parallel versions of a text to go with the same music? And how might this process shed light on the larger picture of this particular manuscript's possible compilers and users, those who would have made up its audience? Arundel 248 is a late 13th century collection of sermons and other religious texts, along with one illustration, prayers, proverbs, poetry, lists, diagrams, and exempla, all fairly typical of the so-called priest's manual. It consists of 4 late 13th century booklets that show signs of continued use into the late 14th century. As it is currently bound, Arundel 248 contains a number of anonymous tracts, as well as Hugh of Saint-Cher's Speculum Missae, and several works by Albertanus of Brescia, including the Ars Loquendi et Stacendi. These materials may not have all circulated in one composite manuscript in the 13th century, but the general impression they prompt, that its owner had access to some very popular texts, for example, over 320 copies of Albertanus of Brescia's works are known, in addition to more obscure and perhaps unique texts, is certainly valid with respect to the musical contents. Arundel 248 contains 12 pieces of music. As Helen Deeming has recently pointed out in her Magisterial Musica Britannica edition of Songs in British Sources, this makes it the second largest collection of music extant from the period 1150 to 1300, the other comparable collection being, of course, Harley 978, with 14 pieces. Each piece in Arundel 248 features lyrics that are written or translated, or both, in English, in the French of England, and or in Latin. Since there remains occasional confusion or ambiguity in the literature as to the number, location, character, and adjacent contents of the pieces of music in Arundel 248, it is worthwhile to provide a comprehensive list. I am not sure that this is displaying well for you all, is it?
No.
To see you.
Oh, you see me? Oh, God. I'm so sorry. All right, let's try this again. I want to screen share, and I want you to see my PowerPoint slides. This worked so beautifully the other day when we tested this out with Lisa. Okay. Let's see. There's that. And I would like to screen share Google. Let me do that. Thank you. Maybe this will do. Can you all see anything?
No, we can't see you now.
Oh. All right. How about now?
Black screen.
It may just
I
be
think
taking a
it's
while.
yes.
Yes.
Coming on.
Got it.
Okay. Oh, lovely. I'm so glad. All right. So,
Can you do a I think sort of the slideshow.
Okay.
sorry?
Once
We- We need to see full screen once.
Oh, it's not at full screen for you, is it now?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Hooray. All right. So, as you can see, the music in Arundel 248 occupies 2 distinct positions in the compilation. There are 3 leaves of a small and perhaps shortened gathering, which consists of 2 bifolia. These are folios 153 to 155, as you can see, and then 2 adjacent leaves from the final gathering, which unfortunately I will not have time to discuss today at all. The 10 pieces copied together on 2x folio seem to form a collection of sorts, consisting of devotional, monophonic, and polyphonic songs. Of these, 5 are contrafacta, or are presented with a parallel translation in the manuscript, or both. This collection, and the processes of translation embedded in it, also connects in several respects to contemporaneous sermon-making practices, as I will address a little bit in my remarks below. The material immediately preceding 10 of the 12 pieces in Arundel 248 ends at the top of the column in which O Labilus, O Flebilus, the first piece, is written, and consists of a section of biblical names arranged in alphabetical order, followed by a glossed Hebrew alphabet. This is executed in a double column format with alternating red and blue initials. The seemingly serendipitous addition of O Labilus, O Flebilus no doubt contributes to the misconception that the music in Arundel 248 was copied on odd pages, or otherwise squeezed into available space left after the rest of the manuscript had been filled. Yet it was clearly only necessary to insert one bifolium in order to accommodate the final section of the alphabet. Hello?
Hello.
Hi! What on earth happened?
No idea.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Shall I just pick up at a suitable later point then?
Yes. Yeah, it said something about an authentication issue, but we're back on now anyway, so it's all good.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, do I need to resume screen sharing? I'm guessing I do. Let's get that going again. All right.
We can see you now.
Hello. All right. Sharing the screen, going to the PowerPoint, play. Here we are. Okay, so in other words, there's every reason to think that the music was copied along with the other contents, not later, and that the compiler gathered it with as much deliberation as the rest of the collection. O Labilus, O Flebilus is well suited to lead off the collection of music for Arundel 248, as it expands on a preoccupation of other materials gathered in the source, the theme of another unicum in the manuscript, a penitential poem, Memorans Novissima Cogitans Futura, which describes the pitiful and changeable condition of humans in language strongly echoing Innocent III's widely popular De Miseria Conditionis Humanae from the end of the 12th century. Of all of the pieces copied in Arundel 248, only Magdalena Laudis Plena is given a generic designation in the source. Sequentia a Magdalena ponunt notam ladibundus on the left, which is written in blue rubrication at the head of the column. The incipit of Magdalena Laudis Plena points to one notable tension in this particular contrafact of that greatest hit, Ladibundus exultet. The writer of the contrafactum has chosen to set the text in regular trochaic tetrameters rather than preserving the more irregular structure of the original, as has been discussed in greater depth by Helen Deeming. The heading for the piece in the right column, Flos Pudicitiae Fleur de Virginité, is Cantus de Domino post cantum aelits, and is almost certainly a reference to the belle Aelits, who recurs repeatedly as a character or topic in lyrics and in lyric insertions in romances and in sermons. Most famously that of the Pseudo-Langton sermon, in which Belle Aelits is presented as a dance song, quoted extensively, and also showed to be a type of the Virgin Mary. In the context of a collection of devotional songs and a larger collection of sermons and sermon-making materials, the rubric seems especially suggestive. Perhaps the compiler wished to have a musical realization of this well-known topic, or sententia, for a sermon. As Siegfried Wenzel, Artis Butterfield, and others have shown, it's common to encounter songs and sermons, often quoted in such a way that what we suppose or know to be the original has been broken up into shorter snippets, sometimes in ways that suggest the sermon writer had no strong understanding of the underlying structure. Wenzel in particular also draws our attention to the common practice of giving quotations of vernacular songs and poems in the vernacular rather than in Latin translation. Flos Pudicitiae Fleur de Virginité thus may potentially represent a musical imagining and a reassembling of material previously encountered in sermons or in manuals for sermon making. It also shows a deep engagement with the relationships between the languages and the music. The opening versicle matches rhyme sounds across the French-Latin divide, pointing to the importance of recreating the sounds of language for the writer of the translation. Flos Pudicitiae Aulabunditiae Mater Misericordiae is matched by Fleur de Virginité, Chambre de Mystété, de Merci Mère et de Pitié. And when similar rhyme sounds are not possible, the same rhyme structure is still preserved, as in the second versicle. In both texts, there's a pronounced density of sounds of end rhymes and assonances, which shift in the final phrase to a contrasting sound, setting this versicle apart from the previous one and corresponding to a change in the melody from the cascading four-note sequences that are at the beginning of the second versicle to repeated notes followed by a cadence formula at septiformis / surmonté. The pairing of these two words points to the kinds of sonic analogies that the writer of the text makes throughout, paralleling A and E or U endings to create a near match that is visual as well as audible, as when in the third versicle the phrase virtutibus ornantibus and ac moribus fernantibus, excuse me, is matched with Danton's avait, que bien poé et assez, so that the ablative plural endings are matched with an EZ ending, so that there's a sort of a visual correspondence as well as a sonic one. These qualities may help explain an oddity in the copying of Flos Pudicitiae Fleur de Virginité. There is an additional line below the lines for the Latin and Anglo-Norman texts, and these were all planned out in advance. However, it seems potentially possible that a text in English was planned as well but never executed. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. However, the scribe ran out of room before reaching the bottom because translating literally from the French into Latin entailed an expansion of phrase length that eventually became unsustainable, as you can see. Angelus ad Virginum, Gabriel from Eveneking, needs little introduction, particularly to this audience. In Arundel 248, the first half of each strophe is written in a block below its music. First of all the Latin, and then the English, followed by the second half of each strophe, copied in the same fashion. Unlike Flos Putatitie, the layout of the two versions of the text was carefully planned so that no space of the writing block is left blank. Although the English text does spill out into the right margin, mostly in the second half of each strophe. This is because the English has fallen an entire line behind the Latin in the first half of the strophe, as indeed one would expect, given that it is not as inflected. The following two pieces in Arundel 248, De milde lom is prado roda and World is bliss nelas no troa, are copied in the same fashion on the rest of the leaf, forming a sub-collection of songs in the vernacular that progresses through the Nativity, the Crucifixion, and then another meditation on the sinfulness and precariousness of the human condition. Excuse me. The English translation of the well-attested Latin text has been closely examined and seems to suggest an East Anglian origin, while the following two pieces seem more consistent with the Southeast Midlands, perhaps London, at least if we believe Dobson. Taken together, this could imply that the compiler had gathered two songs in English from disparate locations and wanted to expand this section, perhaps in order to fill a leaf, with a translation of the well-known Angelus ad Virginum. Any one of the pieces from the main collection of music in Arundel 248 could easily warrant an entire paper of discussion. Angelus ad Virginum, for example, already has several times. Today, however, I will spend a little more time with Salve Virgo Virginum, then Plein de Douceur, which has received almost no attention to date and which serves as a useful further case study in the relationships between the sounds of language and of music in this manuscript. Salve Virgo Virginum is a three-part polyphonic sequence copied in score. On the page, then, the vertical alignment of sounds of notes and words is readily apparent. Copied immediately below it is Van Plein de Douceur, a contrafactum of Salve Virgo Virginum that reworks the original in several significant respects. Salve Virgo Virginum is structured in 3 7-line stanzas. Each of the first 2 stanzas is 7 lines long and alternates 6 and 7 syllable lines, concluding with a 5-line refrain. The last stanza is changed, however, featuring 6 syllable lines instead. The rhyme scheme links the stanzas together. It may be described in the following format. Van Plein de Douceur, by contrast, has stanzas that are 9 instead of 7 lines long, in part because of the expansion necessitated by translation from the Latin. Van Plein de Douceur, however, follows almost the same syllabic form and is regularly structured for the first 2 stanzas, if we stipulate some variation in the pronunciation of terminal e's. If we consider the text side by side, as the manuscript invites us to do, a web of interconnected sounds and meanings emerges. The rhyme schemes do not merely match each other structurally, but also show a visual and sonic echo, with endings matched to endings in the first stanza, and e sounds in both languages corresponding in the first 2 stanzas. Similarly, the sound of the Latin words helps to inspire similar-sounding French ones, as in the beginning of the second stanza, where Porta Salutaris becomes U portas Jesu Christ, which is a pithy gloss for Mary's role as the gate of salvation, if also a commonplace. The Latin text is punctuated by salve and ave at the beginnings of every other line, with one exception at the 3rd line of the second stanza. And the French version deploys this in the refrains. The different sequencing of clauses conceals the extent to which the French version reproduces the Latin, although it is obviously far from a complete or literal translation. Van Plein de Douceur is semantically connected to Stilla veri roris, of course, and Chère mère au créature to Parens genitores. De tu bien garni, however, is not related to anything in the first stanza of the Latin, but rather points to the last lines of the 3rd stanza, Ave specie decus et salutis. The music that is notated for Salve Virgo Virginum consists of 7 phrases that alternate open and closed cadences. The first 4 phrases are pairs of equal length and feature the same pitches, notated identically by the scribe. The 5th phrase is identical to phrases 1 and 3, but the 6th is a truncated form of the 2nd phrase. The 7th phrase, for the textual refrain, introduces different melodic material and a different style of text setting, in that it is melismatic, featuring many pitches per syllable. The scribe was apparently unprepared for this development, and after laying out the rest of the music, neatly and spaciously, was forced to jam the last phrase into the margin. This decision was also likely motivated by the desire to align the beginnings of Salve Virgo Virginum and Van Plan de Douceur on the vertical axis, creating a sort of composite alignment of sonic simultaneities, or a superscore. Since Van Plan de Douceur is no longer than Salve Virgo Virginum, however, the scribe planned ahead for it to occupy 2 braces. And I'll just go back to this. Yes. The music that is notated for Van Plan de Douceur at first blush appears identical to that for Salve Virgo Virginum, except that it includes 2 additional paired phrases for a total of 9. This change turns out to be less trivial and less a direct result of the additional lines of text than it might seem. Although the melodic material exhibits the same overall contour in the first 4 phrases, the 5th phrase of Van Plan de Douceur features prominent additional ornamental notes, differentiate from the first 2 paired phrases and from Salve Virgo Virginum. This has larger implications because the 5th phrase is at the structural midpoint of the piece. Van Plan de Douceur brings out this point, highlighting the quasi-symmetry of the entire piece, a feature that distinguishes it from Salve Virgo Virginum. A more detailed look reveals a number of other differences, mostly involving added ornamental pitches. For example, at Van Plan Chère Mère vers ce cœur, and in the middle voice at Besoigné, moving pitches are added to the lower 2 voices, accentuating the rhyme or the assonance of those pairs, which I think you can see more clearly here. In this respect, one could argue that the setting of the lyrics is somewhat more sensitive to the sound of language and to its structure, although I would not want to press this point. The musical and textual relationships between Van Plan de Douceur and Salve Virgo Virginum are in some respects familiar and predictable. Contrafacts going from Latin to a vernacular are often forced to expand in length relative to the first text, and often reflect to a greater or lesser degree the underlying syntactic structure, rhyme scheme of the source text. Most also show a degree of variability and alteration, and many of the alterations I have traced in these instances relate to note shapes that are sometimes treated interchangeably in the sources. Yet the care with which the translator and composer, who could have been the same person, approached the text and the care with which the scribe copied them, despite evident inexperience with planning spacing for music, suggests a deliberate process of reimagining the sounds and structure of the piece of music and its lyrics. A closer examination of the different versions of lyrics and music in Van Plan de Douceur and Salve Virgo Virginum offers a glimpse of detailed and sustained engagement with the textures of synthesis, musical and lexical. The overall picture, presented by the music copied in Arundel 248, is one of a fascination with reworking devotional lyrics into other languages and occasionally reworking music as well, but also a desire to record songs in Latin, French, and English without translation. Although the unique challenges of writing music with language presented some challenges to the scribes, there's clear evidence that that the overall compilation was assembled with care and with an ear to the parallels. This connects to the larger elements of the music and its texts in sermon making, and to the imagined sounds and interactions of sounds that arise in this context, offering us our own translation of one of the rich ways in which medieval music in England was listened to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. We got there in the end.
Good.
I imagine there'll be some questions. Do people who answer? I think people just need to speak up a little bit. Deaning.
Hello, Monica. It's Helen Deaning speaking. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your paper. It's very interesting, and thank you for referring so generously to my work. I had a question. It's interesting you raised this question about translation expanding in relation to Latin originals, if I do that. It seems to me that there are sort of two different things going on. There's the question of vernacular translation needing more words and more lines to express the same points. And then there's the separate question of the fact that vernacular writing takes up more space on the page because the words themselves are longer, have more letters in them. And I think these come into collision quite interestingly in Philosophy of the City and Third of the Agility today. Because as you rightly point out, the French text is actually a whole stanza shorter, and at first glance it does appear that the scribe simply ran out of room. But having said that, I feel that the French text reached a satisfactory conclusion in its own terms, and it's diverged from the Latin sufficiently in the later part of that song that it doesn't, in a way, seem to me that it's actually missing something in terms of content there. So those two things seem to me to be slightly in tension at that point.
Yes, that's an excellent point. What I notice about it is that the approach of the translator shifts radically in the course of the piece, in that it starts out being a very close translation with very close structuring, and then gradually starts to diverge and become more like a kind of a paraphrased translation in some respects. I absolutely agree that it comes to a satisfactory conclusion, but I suppose part of what intrigues me about this, which I haven't fully worked out, is that it seems to show us a scribe or compiler sort of interacting with the music and with the way that the language could possibly be structured in relation to that, very much in medias res. And so we get a kind of a glimpse of what the priorities seem to have been at the beginning and what, at least implicitly, is a compromise at the end. But your point about it being a satisfying conclusion is very well taken.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and of course, because there are no other sources of either text, nobody can come back with any objection to that thing. But no, I agree. It's an interesting point.
Samantha.
Hi, Monica. I'm Sam. I'm curious. You mentioned the interchangeability of the notation. And I'm looking at these pieces as well, and that's something that has been really puzzling. But specifically, right at the very beginning of the French text, you have this sort of doubled figure. Do you have any thoughts about that relating to text? Because it crops up quite a bit, and I didn't know if you've noticed anything that I may have.
Yeah. Well, I've been wondering about that as well, and one theory that I have that I'm not really sure washes, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts, is that it has something to do with the scribal perception that French has more diphthongs. And, you know, there's this sort of a need to register in the notation that the sound of what would be a single syllable in Latin is somehow sort of redoubled in French, and also for that matter in English in some cases. But it's not something that I've looked at systematically enough to feel confident in that assessment. And of course, we always also have to make the obligatory caveat about the state of the sources. But you know, I would love to hear more of your thoughts about that as well. It's a fascinating little quirk.
Yeah, for the sake of time, let's just say I'll email you. But I would love to communicate more about that. Thank you for your papers.
I think we need to draw things to a close at that point, but just would like to thank you once again, Monica, for your paper.
Just click it. Ooh. Okay. And is that all set to go?
That's all good, yeah.
Hello?
Hello. Hello. Are you ready?
Hello. Yes, I am.
All right.
Hello, Elina.
Hello, Peter. Nice to see you.
We're hearing you loud and clear.
Oh, good. Thank you.
We will, I think, get going. Do we just
Yes, do. Yeah.
Right, okay. So Elina Hamilton currently holds a part-time faculty position at the Boston Conservatory. She received her doctorate from Bangor University after submitting her dissertation, entitled Walter of Evesham Abbey and the Intellectual Milieu of 14th Century English Music Theory. In 2009, she was the recipient of the 125th anniversary PhD Research Scholarship at Bangor, and in 2012 was awarded the Draper's Company Medal for Outstanding Postgraduate Contribution. Her research has been presented at conferences in Spain, Croatia, Italy, and elsewhere, and at academic institutions including the Universities of St Andrews, Oxford, Princeton, and MIT. Her forthcoming article on authority within 14th century English treatises will be published in Musica Disciplina. And her paper is entitled, What Did They Read? Getting to Grips with the Sources for 14th Century English Music Theory. Elina.
Thank you, Peter. I hope everyone has a handout or a version of a handout on the iPads, because I will be referring to that quite frequently. And unfortunately, I'm sorry you're going to have to bear with my face up on the screen, because I don't have a PowerPoint for this presentation. The theme of this conference is simple: to make an assessment of the musical landscape of England before 1500. The execution of this aim, however, as many of you already know, is complex on various levels. Although tools for research have increased in recent years, including the ability to repeatedly examine digital manuscripts from the comfort of one's home office, the overwhelming data that one can pick through has, in the words of our conference organizers, left discussions of music from the period unexplored. This is true also for music treatises in England. My own research on 14th century music treatises has been driven by the desire to provide a context within which they were made. I do this by unfolding the content of treatises as well as investigate the surrounding circumstances of each manuscript object. Just as the way in which musical pieces must be placed within their original surroundings, the texts of music treatises must also find their way back into their original context if we are to make sense of what took place in the Middle Ages. A full engagement with those who cultivated and disseminated music in England before 1500 must also include the intellectual developments and interests of contemporaries who first read and created the music treatises that remain today. My research investigates the intellectual milieu of speculative music treatises in medieval England. This milieu is revealed through the choices of music treatises compilers put into their manuscripts. The selected treatises were written by authors who also chose which authorities to quote from. Some authors, even late medieval ones, become authorities themselves. De Origine et Effectu Musicae is one example of how a treatise, and the manuscript that preserve it, can offer significant information of an intellectual milieu in medieval England through its citation of authority. Although this little-known treatise, written early in the 15th century, was considered by Gilbert Rene to be one of value for understanding literary sources commonly known among scholars of speculative music, assessing the value of the authorities quoted is still a task to be determined. A rich selection of literary sources are evident in the extensively quoted texts from treatises such as the Quattroquinquepalia, but also in a list of authorities which he recalls in one grand sweep. First, there was Moses, then Tubal, Pythagoras, the king of Cyrus, Incuriatus, whom he seems to think is a person, not the title of a treatise, Boethius, Isidore, Guido, Franco, Philip de Vitry, Johannes de Muris, and many others of whom he says he can no longer remember their names. The act of naming and quoting from authority is not an isolated case among other English authors. In Breviarium Regulae Musicae, found exclusively in Oxford Bodley 842, for example, Williamson refers to the writings of the auctoritas such as Boethius, Franco, Walter of Evesham Abbey, and John of Torquay, implying either his superiority among others through his knowledge of, for he did write early in the treatise his great efforts to investigate all sources of theory, or that these names were commonly known to his readers. Neither De Origine et Defectu Musicae nor Breviarium Regulae Musicae were quoted by other authors. Yet, in manuscript sources and treatises alike, certain authors and texts appear over and over again. What, then, made one text so appealing for authors to quote as authorities and compilers to include recurrently in new manuscripts? This paper will set to establish the authorities in music treatises in medieval England. Table 1 in your handout lists all 14 manuscripts which contain 14th century English treatises of music. I have highlighted in bold the titles of these texts in each manuscript for easy reference. So the bolded titles are English authors. A cursory glance shows that only 3 manuscripts contain single treatises. All others are compilations of long and short texts from various periods which reflect various interests. Has reiterated the significance for the type of compilation, indicating that the collection of text and its codicological structure are key components to understanding influence, relation, and even the profile of those who use them. To navigate the types of medieval book compilations, Quacko offers a categorization for different types of manuscripts prominent in the Middle Ages. You can find a list of his types on page 3 of your handout. Type 1, he says, is a manuscript copied in one go. This type of manuscript includes the author's work in one continuous production from scratch without additional text included. And he actually reiterates that this one-go manuscript could be written by several different scribes or perhaps over a short period. So there's a slight discrepancy in the scribe's text, and yet there's a continuous production that's obvious. Type 2 is the booklet copied in one go. Quacko states, Type 2 represents a cluster of texts from a single author that is found in the midst of one or more production units that contain texts by other authors. Type 3 is the composite manuscript that contains several works by a single author. And Type 4 is the composite manuscript with additional leaves or quires, allowing more space for supplementary texts which were added at different times. I have identified each of the manuscripts on Table 1 with these manuscript types. Organized this way, there are largely 2 different types of manuscripts, Type 2 and Type 4. Cambridge Trinity College 0929 is a good example of a Type 2 manuscript. This manuscript contains lengthy treatises covering extensive texts among smaller works, which often can be written within only a folio or 2, in between the excerpts, or becoming excerpts of longer passages. It is a Type 2 manuscript precisely because of codicological uniformity. It was copied in one single style with similarly decorated initials from the first treatise until the final. Thus, although being a combination of different treatises, it is not a manuscript that was copied out at various times, but rather was copied deliberately to include these specific treatises. Oxford Bodley Library Bodley 842, which is number 10 in your handout, is another noteworthy Type 2 manuscript. The manuscript compilation is made in similar style throughout, resulting in a unification of presentation. Nestled between longer treatises, again, are shorter excerpts. Type 2 manuscripts show that those interested in compiling theoretical sources were not satisfied with one single author's work. Similar to Type 2, but with an ongoing production, is the Type 4 manuscript, also prevalent among manuscripts listed in Table 1. These manuscripts add sections as an ongoing project. Oxford Bodley 515 is a prime example of this manuscript. Not only does the manuscript contain a mixture of texts added on various times, it also is made from irregular leaves and quires, giving it a rough appearance on several levels. It is worth mentioning that within the list of manuscripts containing 14th century treatises, there are no Type 3 manuscripts, those that combine several works of a single author. Unlike Boethius's De Institutione Musica, which often copied alongside his De Institutione Arithmetica in the 13th century, all English authors of speculative music theory are only known for their single works. When bringing all sources together in one table, the treatises that were copied out more than once become especially evident. Declaratio Trianguli by Torquacy, for example, is found in 4 manuscripts: Vatican Library, Regular Latin 1146, London British Library Additional 21455, British Library Lansdowne 763, and Cambridge Trinity College 0929. Included within this short treatise is a triangular diagram that can be used as a didactic tool to learn the relationship of music notation. The simple and straightforward diagram must have been considered extremely useful to learning the newly developed notation. It is later highlighted within the Breviarium Regulae Musicae, where Williamson reconstructs the mnemonic device with an additional triangle of rests. The most widely circulating treatise, however, was the Quattro Principalia by John of Tewkesbury. Spanning from the etymology of music to the division of a monochord to the discussion of the types of musical compositions, it is not hard to see why so many sources contain partial or full variations of this treatise. It is also uniquely one of the few texts that is found in a single volume manuscript, number 14 in your handout. What Table 1 illustrates is that the story of English music theory owes much to 15th century compilations of earlier writings. As such, several problems rise to the surface. The main being that what is extant from the 15th century could only be what was considered significant then. Those treatises that we have access to today may not represent the entire discourse that took place in the 14th century. While compilers in the 15th century found it necessary to include these seminal texts in their new manuscripts, authors of treatises early in the 14th century found ways to quote extensive passages within their new texts in a slightly different manner. Consequently, the only way we can create a convincing milieu of intellectual activity in medieval England is through the auctoritas found embedded as quotes within texts in the 14th century. Example 1 on page 4 of your handout categorizes 4 treatises: Walter of Evesham Abbey's De Speculatione Musicae, John of Tewkesbury's Quattro Principalia, Williamson's Breviarium Regulae Musicae, and Hanboy's Summa. And I categorize these into 2 groups. And for the sake of time, I selected these 4 specifically as good examples for what I wanted to say today. The first group of treatises were written early in the 14th century, sometime between 1300 and 1350. The second were written later in the century, sometime in the last quarter of the 1300s. They are significant here because they quote from the first group of treatises giving the first group a position of authority. The pie charts represent references made to each authority, the number on the left, and the overall frequency of an authority found within the treatise, the percentage on the right. For example, Walter's De Speculatione Musicae contains 21 references to Boethius's Musica throughout the treatise, which results to 18% of references found within the treatise. Quattro Principalia, on the other hand, has 32 identifiable quotes from Boethius's Musica, amounting to 16% of quotations in his treatise. The author of Quattro Principalia, however, also quoted 4 times from Boethius's Musica as it is found in Lambertus's Ars Musica, making the total Boethian quotes 18%. Both of the Group 1 treatises also include references from Isidore, Guido, and Franco. The white portion of the pie chart represents the number of chapters with no specific reference to an authority. The pie charts representing Group 2 treatises include texts from earlier treatises, as well as those written in the 14th century. Their choices are distinctly English authors or other texts that were likely available manuscripts which existed in England at the time. What is striking about Group 2 treatises, however, is the significantly fewer references to any authority. The total number of references in Williamson's treatise, for example, are 8, in comparison to the 72 in De Speculatione Musica and the 103 in Quattro Principalia. The same can be seen in Hanboy's Summa, who only referred to Franco and Hanlo through 17 references. Alistair Minnis has shown that younger authors in the late Middle Ages were eager to reveal a certain level of comprehension of the Auctoritas in their given field of knowledge, for doing so implied that they had mastered the works of the masters. Minnis further notes that the role of medieval author was to assert the importance of an authoritative passage. Thus, and I quote, "The work of an auctor was a book worth reading, and a book worth reading had to be the work of an auctor," end quote. Though Minnis bypasses a discussion of music texts in his discussion of other codivial subjects, it is not because traces of authority do not exist in music treatises. They are, on the contrary, abundantly there. The authorities highlighted in these 4 treatises alone reveal that English authors read the writings of speculative theory, both of seminal texts also in existence in other regions of Europe, but also within their own country. These younger authors perceived themselves to be dwarves in the shadow of the ancients. Yet they had a need to update what literature was available to them in order to write treatises relevant to their readers. Table 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3 show 3 of the Auctoritas found within the 4 selected English treatises above. Table 2.1 shows the chapters of Boethius quoted in various treatises, surprisingly revealing that all 5 books were readily quoted from. The extensive quotes from chapters in Guido and Franco's treatises unfold a very similar story. It can be assumed that the more times a chapter is represented in multiple treatises, the more likely it was a useful chapter to those authors. Several times in all of the selected Auctoritas, here do we find multiple treatises referring to the same chapter. These tables, we can suppose, then, directly reflect the interest of the later authors as they took the writings of Auctoritas as complete works, even if they only quoted from certain passages. So as a means of conclusion, music treatises are primarily texts. They are literary works which first and foremost discuss music, but are also not isolated from other prominent disciplines of their day. For this reason, it is just as crucial to understand the implication and placement of music theory among a larger environment of medieval reading and learning culture. It is equally important to understand the manuscript as an object of evidence alongside the textual lineage if we are to reconstruct context from medieval music theory. In this paper, I have explored the text of music theory from medieval England in 2 different ways, through the surviving manuscripts and through the use of authority. The manuscripts within which the treatises from the 14th century are preserved offer us evidence of a different kind, that later compilers gathered texts of interest which were bundled together by those who commissioned the scribes to write them. For these, the question must be why a compilation of texts was made in the first place. The research on manuscript studies undertaken by Richard and Mary Rouse is well known to most medievalists interested in formulating a contextual history. Their investigation is based on 3 simple questions, which I have also tried to ask in this paper. Why should a work written in one context of place and time be recopied in another? Why should texts composed by different authors in different eras be recopied in combination? And what happens when a text has no intrinsic relevance to a given subject? The given subject is treated as though it had some relevance. In some ways, modern-day editions are not too different from the objectives of medieval compilers. The new compilations of medieval texts in the 20th century editions reflect our interests in much the same way that those commissioned in the manuscripts in the 15th century did. When a manuscript was compiled, the choice of texts to be included were carefully selected to reflect the needs or the particular interests of the compiler of the day, and we must acknowledge their intent as much as the intent of the authors quoting authorities within new texts. In order to explore the musical landscape of medieval England completely, then, we are required to take into consideration how and in what way texts were transmitted in the objects that we have in our archives today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Elina. We are running a little bit late, and so I just need to check with one of the organisers.
I did check with James. I said, is it all right that we're running a bit late? I said, can he postpone the dinner?
Right, so we can have a few questions, can we? Good. Well, thank you so much. I think for many of us, this represents a rather daunting field, and I wanted to thank you not just for the paper, but for this marvellous handout, which I think we'll take away and file away very carefully, because it's just such a mine of useful information. Question? Meg.
Elina, Meg here. Thank
Hello.
You. Hello, hello. It was a wonderful paper, and you've done a huge amount of work, and you've raised some very challenging questions, I think. I just have a couple of small points. One is that for your type 3, single author of different works, this is for England, presumably, because we don't have authors who've written more than one work.
Exactly. Thank you for correct. Yes, thank you for that. Yes.
For the examples I can think of type 3 manuscripts in music theory are the Prosdochimus manuscripts that have a whole series of his treatises, and the Tinctorius, for example, the Tinctorius Brussels manuscript that has a lot. So I think that it's a function of that may indeed raise a question that we don't know how to answer. Why didn't they write more organized treatises and more of them? Just one other question. You talked about identifiable quotes and identified quotes. Now, of these proportions that you give, how much of this is quotations that are where the treatise says, as Boethius said, as so-and-so said, and how much is identifiable by you, which of course leaves open the question that although you've identified a lot, there may still be a lot more unidentified material to identify. Can you address that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a very good point that you raised. So from what I can gather with these authors, the different authors have a different way of quoting, so to speak, the text. Some of them will just slip it into their own prose, but it's clearly from a Boethian tradition, and that is that's how it has been identified in previous editions as coming from Boethius, and so I've taken that and placed these in here. Other times, we do have authors say in Boethius, this is what he says, and we all know this type, there's a kind of a general understanding that this is an understood text of the time. It really is a case-by-case study, and each author treats this use of quotation in a very different way, and I think there's something to be said about that particular way as well. Like Walter, for example, I think he only mentions Boethius once in his text, and yet he's clearly presenting Boethian ideas within his text. Throughout his text is completely identifiable, and I definitely know that there's a lot more work to be done in identifying the little tiny quotations that haven't been sorted out yet. So. there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
It's complicated by the fact that that very often the quotations are made by the theorist inexactly.
Exactly.
Even with the kind of resources of searching that you're obviously using and that Karen is setting up, it's not going to be easy to check word strings when they have adapted.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Matthew.
Hi, Elina. It's Matthew Thompson here.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi. I was just going to ask, really interesting that you show they're definitely quoting from kind of older authorities such as Franco and Boethius, etc., and they're also quoting from other English authors. Do you think that these English theory authors are also interacting with contemporary continental music theory that's being written at the same time? Do they have different occupations or different preoccupations about what they want to talk about, or are they not, or do they have separate concerns? See what I mean?
That's a very good question. It's something I'm continually working on, and I think it'll be interesting to see what types of transmission is happening. My initial instinct at the moment, and this could change as I continue to do this work, is that actually in the later 14th century, the type 2 or the group 2 that I put together, the Williamson and Handboys, those treatises seem to be really reading what is available in England at the time, and maybe not as concerned with these auctoritas that are coming from the continent as much as those who are already in existence in England. But there's plenty more work to be done. Renata Piergastini is doing work between Italian and English connections, and she's found some very interesting connections there, and I think that can be expanded a lot more in future research too. So it's a very good question, and it's something that I want to look into more.
Right.
I think Karen has a question, I think. I can see her waving here.
I'm communicating. If you unmute her on Hangouts, she can ask it.
Can you unmute her?
Oh, will you wave again, Karen? There we go.
Right. Well, while that's being dealt with, Ralph, a quick one. We're running out of time.
Okay. Alina, can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
It's not unmuted.
Hi, Alina. Just a quickie, and apologies if you glossed over this and I missed it, but there's a lot fewer quotes in the Wilhelmus and the Handboys than there are in the Group 1 ones you cited. And although they are shorter treatises, they're not that much shorter. Is there any reason why they're choosing not to quote their sources, or is this entirely new material?
That is the question. It's the question I've been trying to sort out. My understanding so far is that there was a need to update both of these treatises, Handboys and Wilhelmus, take previous English authors and regurgitate and reapply. They look at them as the ancients from the earlier 14th century, and they seem to be needing to update something. And so perhaps it's because their agenda is different from the earlier 14th century, that earlier in the 14th century they needed to compile more authoritative things to validate whatever they were writing earlier on, and then later there's just a brief update. They are shorter treatises, but there seems to be a shift in the century towards less quotations in the treatises.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but I was going to say a very quick one, Karen, please.
Yeah, it's fine. It's probably already been covered in some of Elena's answers to the other questions. I mean, my big thing was about these graphs are great. I mean, it's a really good way of just thinking, being able to think in a new way about these things. But my question was, related to that idea of direct quotes or references, because I think that can be quite sort of misrepresent the situation. So, like, for example, in the John of Tewkesbury graph, I mean, I would say that he relies quite a lot on the theory of Jean de Moore and also probably Philippe de Vitry, but they're not even referenced in the graph here. So, like, the direct quotes are sort of you know, they're your standards of music theory, Boethius, you know, Lambertus, lots of people quote these all the time, Isidore Franco. I mean, they're the sort of the standards, but the interesting thing will be figuring out the influences of, you know, as Matthew mentioned, the contemporaneous writers on music theory and how they managed to get weaved into this.
Yeah, that's very true. That's something I'm working on, I think, in the next pie chart.
Yeah.
Not to mention the factus doctor that Karen has discussed so brilliantly in relation to the anonymous citations in Japanese.
Absolutely, yeah.
We must draw to a close. Thank you once again, Elina.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Just to say, everyone, we're going to tail the tea and coffee rather dramatically. So if we can sort of get the tea and coffee and then move it back in here, as long as you don't mind talking to people slurping. I tried to move the restaurant booking back and they just said no.